Hello students and welcome to chapter 1.4, and this is video 1 in 1.4 and there is only one video because it's a fairly short chapter. So chapter 1.4 is called Stakeholders, and the syllabus, and this is the fourth chapter within topic 1, Introduction to Business Management. And the chapter, the syllabus is fairly short. We are looking at internal and external stakeholders, and then we'll be looking at how conflict can occur between stakeholders and what can be done about it. So firstly, what is a stakeholder? So a stakeholder can be defined as a person or an organization who is affected by the decisions of a business. So if you take a school, for example, who is affected and who is interested in the decisions of the school? Well, students will be interested, parents will be interested, teachers as employees, principals, etc., etc. And it's the same for any type of business. Now we can break down stakeholders into internal and external stakeholders. Internal stakeholders are persons who are part of the organization and are located within the business. So, for example, we have shareholders or investors, managers, and employees. And then we have external stakeholders who are not part of the organization. And so there are lots of these, for example, customers, suppliers, governments, banks, etc. And then what's important to note is that some people will fall into two different. Oh, I'm just trying to move myself around. There we go. Some people may fall into two groups. So, for example, an employee may be an internal stakeholder, but they also might be part of a pressure group. Or alternatively, an employee may be a shareholder, in which case they will operate as two different stakeholders within the organization. It's also important to note, we'll get to in a minute, but different stakeholders are going to have different interests. And therefore, at times, there's going to be a conflict between those interests. And that's kind of what this chapter is about. And we'll go through that a little bit later on. So what are the interests of a different type of stakeholders? So firstly, the internal stakeholders will go through generally what they're looking for and what they're going to be interested in with the business. So firstly, employees will be interested in trying to get paid as much as possible, but they'll also want job security. They'll want to have some sort of line of promotion in most cases, and also good and fair working conditions. Now, obviously, they're looking for other things as well, but those are the main ones that they're going to be looking for. Managers and the board of directors will want to maximize their own salary, bonus, and perks and fringe benefits. They'll want responsibility to make decisions. They're also going to be looking to satisfy shareholders, because ultimately it's the shareholders going to be voting for the board of directors. And therefore, they'll be looking to maximize profits in the business. Shareholders will want the share price to go up, so they'll want profits to be as high as possible. They'll want a dividend as possible, and they'll also want effective management. So you can see that these two there's a crossover between these. In chapter 2.7 in the syllabus, Industrial Employee Relations, the syllabus talks about the relationship between employees and managers. And that chapter is a real, takes a deep dive into the relationship between these two. So what about external stakeholders? Well, customers will want a reasonable price. They'll want a good choice, quality product. And these days, more and more, customers are interested in companies that produce things sustainable and have a positive impact on the environment, society, etc. Suppliers want the company to pay them on time. They want a good relationship with the business, and they'll generally want long-term contracts so that they have some stability themselves. The government will be interested in the business because the business is creating jobs in the local community. They want to make sure they're complying with the law, paying tax, and the government might also be customers for some of these businesses. Pressure groups are going to want the business to follow their vision. So, for example, there are environmental pressure groups such as Greenpeace. And so Greenpeace are going to want to make sure that the business is doing things which are good for the environment. Same with human rights and human rights pressure groups such as Amnesty International. The local community is also going to be looking for a positive impact on the local community, so things such as jobs and the impact on society there. Competitors are going to shape their strategy to some extent by what the business does. They're also going to be able to compare their performance against this business. And also, since they're competitors, they, in some respects, are going to be interested in the competition because competition can drive us to do better. And so they're going to be very interested in that. Banks are going to be interested. Can the business pay back their loan? So maybe a bank has loaned them money. So can they pay that back? Will they be able to pay it back on time? And they're also going to want to create good relations with the company because ultimately the bank wants them to come back and borrow more money because then the bank can make money through giving them loans. So if we talk about the conflict between stakeholders, so firstly, there's not always going to be conflict. So in many situations, there will be agreement between the stakeholders. So the stakeholders will be aligned and in agreement. So for example, if we look at a business, if they make higher profit, that in theory should lead to higher dividends. And therefore, so that should say shareholders. And so therefore, shareholders will be happier. Then also, if there's higher profits, then the managers and directors should get higher bonuses, and also the higher profits, in theory, could lead to higher salary increases for employees. Now, this is not always the case, but there is a logic here that those things will happen, and therefore everyone will be happy with higher profits. Secondly, another example is that the business use more environmentally friendly packaging, then customers will be more satisfied because they buying products which are more sustainable. Employees will be motivated to some extent because they feel that their company is making a better impact on the environment or a less bad impact on the environment. And then pressure groups will be satisfied because they'll see the business making efforts towards environmental sustainability. Now, in both of these situations, there's a lot of alignment between the stakeholders. So we don't necessarily have stakeholders disagreeing in all situations. But there will be disagreements in certain situations, and it's inevitable. Now, there are many reasons why stakeholders may have conflicts, but here are a few examples. So, for example, managers versus consumers. Managers may want to raise the price of the product in order to make higher profits, or maybe costs have gone up and management will want to pass the costs on to the consumer. But obviously the consumer may not want the price to rise. And as a result, some customers may go elsewhere to other companies, or they might buy less. And so there is a conflict between that situation, but at some point the management will have to raise the price. Then we have managers versus shareholders. So when the business makes a profit, the shareholders will want high dividend payouts so that they can get return on their investment. But managers may want to use that money for some other reason, from a purely personal reason. They may want to give themselves higher bonuses. And so the higher dividend payment may lead to lower bonuses for them, lower salary increases for employees. Or the management might just want to put the money back into the business as retained profit in order to grow the business long term. So there's going to be some way of having to balance the objectives between the two stakeholders there. And next up, shareholders or managers versus pressure groups. Shareholders, in theory, may not be worried about the environmental harm. They may only be interested in the profits, but then pressure groups would obviously be concerned. Now, I'm not saying that all shareholders are not interested in the impact on the environment, but it's possible that a business may have shareholders who are not interested, and obviously there's going to be some conflict there. So that's most of the syllabus covered for this chapter, but I just want to talk quickly about how conflict can be solved between the stakeholders. Now, in theory, a lot of the syllabus in this subject is about how we can make sure that we don't have stakeholder conflict and we can make the best decisions to prevent that. But here are just a few ideas. So firstly, if there is a conflict, then the management will need to consider what are the objectives of the business. So if the management are making a decision which is bad for the environment, or they're considering a decision, then have a look at the objectives of the business. Do they have strong environmental objectives? Are they a social enterprise who has environment high up their list of priorities? If that's the case, then management are clearly going to consider those objectives in their decision making. Similarly, for paying a living wage to employees, if they've put that into their objectives, into their mission statement, then they're going to have to consider those objectives. So when making decisions and forming strategy for the business, what are the objectives is a key thing that's going to lead to less stakeholder conflict. Or if there is conflict, then we favor the stakeholders that are most important to the business. You can also consider the power. Now, again, we can't always make decisions that are going to satisfy every stakeholder. But as a business, we'll want to favor those stakeholders, one, with the most interest and the ones most aligned with the objectives of the business. But also, what about the power? Now, these days, consumers are starting to demand that businesses are more ethical and more environmentally sustainable. So consumers as a stakeholder have become more powerful, and businesses now need to consider them more strongly. The same with pressure groups. And the third one is more of a preventative issue, which is when decisions are being made, consider multiple stakeholders in mind. Now, historically, a lot of companies were run just for profit, whereas these days companies are starting to focus more on like the impact on the environment. So considering pressure groups, consumers, and shareholders, the strategy of the business will be to consider all of these. And therefore, if you consider more stakeholders in mind when making decisions, then you're more likely to prevent major stakeholder conflicts happening. Now, this diagram on the right, this is a stakeholder matrix. It's a way of assessing how we deal with different stakeholders. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but basically, we look at how powerful the stakeholder is. We look at how interested they are. And then this matrix will then give the business a way of dealing with that stakeholder. So if a stakeholder has low power but is interested, then we'll want to keep them informed. If they are powerful, then we want to manage them actively. This is not part of the syllabus, but this is a way which we can deal with stakeholder conflict. Okay, that's the syllabus done. See you next time.